Hello everyone and welcome to another one of these D&D Sandbox videos. Today I'm going to be doing the first part of a two-part video. I'm going to be doing a little bit of a different format for things, so if you can, comment down below and let me know what you think about the new format. This is actually going to be part one of a response to someone that was asking me about how to make players feel like they're sort of leveling up in the world. How do you get that sense of progression where the characters come out of being itinerant adventurers into being the movers and shakers, maybe kings and queens, integrating into this larger plot of the world? And I think that in order to have that conversation, I need to have this one first. And it's going to be about how people progress mechanically in a D&D sandbox. So let's go ahead and jump into it. For this one, I'm going to be switching it from you looking at me to you looking at the screen. And the purpose for this is the fact that I think having some visuals here might make things a little bit easier. So let's jump into this. Building a D&D sandbox, player progression. How do we actually get people to feel like they're actually becoming stronger in the world? How do they get that moment of, aha, I'm now on top of the mountain? So the first thing is we're going to just talk about how we design encounters, right? We're going to talk a little bit about how we put these ideas in front of people and how we make them feel like they have power. And a lot of times for adventurers, they are defined by what they're going against, right? An adventurer that's going to be fighting against a bunch of goblins and kobolds is fundamentally different on some level from one that's going to be slaying dragons at the same rate. So you have this idea that part of your progression is going to be in the types of things that you fight. Now, that is good, but there's sort of another element to it that we need to translate from other media into the tabletop experience, and that's what I want to focus on today. So the other media thing is the conservation of ninjutsu, right? A single ninja is a story arc defining dramatic threat. They're someone who's built up, you know their name, you know what they're going to be doing, they've got a laundry list of abilities. But 100 ninjas, they're just the dudes in black suits that are, ninja number 44, and you don't need to know anything about them. And that idea that what's in front of the camera and what's in front of the hero of whatever the story is, the more there are of it, the less power they can have, is a balancing act, right? That's actually something that we experience as dungeon masters when we're building encounters. So let's kind of explain that as, rather than it being ninjas or rather than it being something that is very loose for story, let's talk about it in the version of conservation of drama in an encounter budget, right? So PF2 and D&D and a bunch of other games, they all do this a little differently, but if you're running a D&D style or a D&D adjacent game, it is going to function in very similar ways because you're looking at a percentage of the EXP total should be sort of a percentage of the dramatic weight. Now, Pathfinder 2, the amount of EXP that you have just to buy things stays static depending on how strong the encounter is, and the EXP of the monsters changes based on the relative level between the players and the monster. And a lot of D&D, rather than doing it that way, they flip it where the monster's EXP stays the same, but you have a bigger and bigger and bigger encounter budget to work with as you're sort of buying these creatures. And when you're putting these things in, you're making this dramatic encounter, you kind of need to think about what dramatic weight everything that you're putting in is going to have. A monster that is 1% of the total EXP of an encounter, they're not even probably going to get their own token on the board. They're going to be part of a swarm, a mass, a thing that's generated during the combat, something that's spawned, or maybe something that is an effect, like an environmental type thing that you're playing into this. So those things are, beneath the idea of even the henchmen. And then you've got the 5%ers, the guys where you've got maybe 20 of them all together in a big mass is one big combat. And those guys are minions, they're throwaway monsters, they're henchmen that don't really get any screen time, things like that. They're all the Foot Clan members that are off to the side that you don't know who they are, but you know who Shredder is. And if they're half of the total EXP of a fight, then that can get a lot more interesting. Those are people that are going to start having, once you're about 50% of the limelight of the encounter, you're going to be maybe part of a dynamic duo. Maybe you're the leader with some slightly more powerful henchmen. You're going to have a thing where this person is elite. Now, we'll get a little bit more into defining terms here in a minute, but the idea here is, right, you're taking up half of the encounter budget. That means that you need about half of the villain's screen time in order to fulfill that role in the encounter. And then in the far end of things, you've got boss monsters. You have the 100% of the EXP total is this single guy, and that's a lot of weight on that guy's shoulders in order to perform. Or maybe it's 90% or 95%, and they have some disposable mooks that are added in there, maybe to aid or to light fires for the Grandmaster's interest, things like that. You have these other things that are around, but they're not really important for the drama of what's happening here, and whether they live or die is not really going to be relevant. And just to give a couple quick examples is, say you've got a 100% EXP goblin. That is the Goblin Lord. That is someone that even for a low-level party, right, even this for level 1 parties, if you're going to make an encounter that is, an encounter budgeted thing, right, a thing that is designed to be a challenge for a group, even at level 1, if that's going to be a single goblin, that goblin has to have name. That goblin has to be something that everyone knows her presence. There is a reason why this goblin is in the limelight. And that's partially mechanics, but also partially drama, right? A normal random goblin is very unlikely to be center stage because they don't represent mechanically enough to actually focus any of the story into what's really going on here. The only time that it can really be like that is for maybe comedic effect. Now, by that same token, if you've got 10 goblins that are all 10% EXP apiece, that might be your standard troop of goblins, right? That's a pretty decent horde of goblins. This group might be level 2 or 3 or something like this. And, maybe the goblins are mixed anywhere between, 5% and 20% EXP, but they're all in that kind of average range. And this is going to be those massive enemies that they're individuals by this point, but they're not really named things. And then maybe the only one that actually gets a name is the one that the PCs leave alive to interrogate about what happens next. And then if you've got 1% EXP goblins, that means that this swarm of goblins is probably part of something much bigger, right? Like the goblins are focused on staying alive in this thing, and they aren't really contributing to the drama of what's happening here, except as a way of showing that there has been progression, right? This is one of the tools that we're going to be talking about using, is the fact that if these 10 goblins were 10% EXP goblins a few levels ago for the players, and those 10 goblins on their own were an actual threat, and now that it's a little bit later in the campaign, a little bit later in the story arc, that same number or type of goblins is in an encounter, but they function dramatically very different. And when the DM shines a spotlight on those 10 goblins, they can remind the players that this used to be a challenge. This used to be a threat, and this little troop of goblins is just trying their damnedest to stay alive on this battlefield that is about trolls or dragons or something much bigger than little goblins. Now, there's a bunch of different things that we can kind of go into here for specifics, but I'm going to take a moment to talk about 4th edition. Now, 4th edition D&D is not going to be a huge part of this, but as far as defining some of these terms, it's very, very useful. So in 4th edition, there was a standard monster. This is what you consider a normal CR monster. That is 1-to-1 for the players, right? So if you got 5 players, you would have 5 standard monsters, and that would be an encounter, and you could raise or lower the levels of the monster to make it harder or easier. Now, what they also did was they allowed within the leveling system, within the type of monster that you were playing, to be able to tweak that encounter budget, right? That percentage of the encounter that's about that one monster based on a subtype. And that was the subtype scaling system. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today in a more broad terms, but I need to get you familiar with the 4th edition pieces first. So this little chart that I have here has 2 graphs, one on the left, one on the right, and then 2 columns on the left and the right. The left is the actual EXP for monsters and what they represent at the different levels. So a level 1 solo is equivalent to a level 6 elite, which is equivalent to a level 10 standard, a level 18 minion, and then a level 26 piece of terrain. That's just how the EXP budget part of it works, right? And I actually kind of shorten it a little bit when I play and when I run stuff. I take out all the gaps, right? I just sort of crunch it down a little bit so that if I ever wanted to use a creature, as long as it was somewhere on the scale, I could put it into an encounter and I would know what it would need to have. And on the far end of it, you can see on the other the second graph is skill challenges. That means that this monster is beyond the players. And you can see in the bottom that there is sort of a track, right? If you want to make this standard monster that we are using less of a dramatic thing, you move them to the left, down the track. They go and become a minion, right? They're a background character. Now they're a nameless mook even more than they were before. And if you really want to kind of push it down that these things are well beneath the players, they are now terrain. And by the same token, you can push it up the scale, right? You can make it elite. It is now something that is a bigger part of the encounter budget. It doesn't change the level as much, which can oftentimes have some issues with CR having some changes built into it because it just tweaks the encounter budget in a very weird way, and some of the abilities that come in there, if they're much higher level, don't really work. You know, if you're playing 5th edition, you might have a wizard that has the right defenses and hit points and things to be able to be a really easily taken down thing, but they might be able to upcast like Fireball, and if they can upcast Fireball on a level 1 group, it's probably gonna be not too super relevant that this wizard only has 12 or 14 AC. So it doesn't work perfect and everything, but let's kind of go with what this is designed to do, which is to push you up or down the focus of it. And if you're a solo creature, you're supposed to be that 90 to 100%, right? You're everything to these things. And one of the reasons that I like this system, and one of the reasons that I'm going to be talking about it when I'm talking about player progression, is the idea that if they are constantly fighting things that are their own level, right? If they are leveling up themselves, then they don't kind of notice that what they're fighting is not as strong or is stronger than what they fought before. They have to rely, or the DM has to rely exclusively on the types of things you're fighting. You were fighting goblins, now you're fighting hobgoblins, now you're fighting ogres, now you're fighting trolls, now you're fighting, you have to scale it up in type, but a lot of the numbers stay the same in our D&D and D&D adjacent systems, even with 5th edition where it's got a bit of a flattened math, about half of the scaling of like something like 4th edition. It still gives you this feel that, I hit on a 9 before, we're 10 levels later, I'm fighting, different things, but I'm still hitting on a 9, and you don't sort of feel that mechanical progression, but you can if you end up fighting something that you fought beforehand, but is now much weaker. Although the problem is that when you design an encounter where either the CR or the level of the monster is radically outside the terrain, it is completely useless. It's no longer just like, oh, it has a hard time hitting and a hard time damaging you. It's effectively pointless, and you're just kind of praying for a critical hit when you're rolling against the monsters, or when you're rolling against the players as the monsters, and as the monsters themselves, they have so low hit points. They're like, yeah, they'll probably die in one hit, but if they don't because someone rolled low, or you're just pinging from another ability that's just taking a small amount of damage, then you have to track a bunch of these low-level hit point monsters, whereas if they were just turned into minions, you wouldn't have to do that. They would just take 1 damage and die. So the idea here is that you can kind of get this spread. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the top end of this black mark at the top of this level 5 solo chart. So level 5 solo means that it's designed to be at level 5 for a group of players. This is the monster. This is the focus of everything. This is your big bad. This is your, at level 5, this is your early level, young dragon, something like that. And when you get into the black area, then it doesn't actually function like a combat. And the same thing with the terrain, right? The terrain can also be part of maybe a scene and a skill challenge, or maybe just a description as the players are mowing their way through this army of mooks. And, the same style as some of the video games that can sort of have you go through these faceless guys that don't really functionally do anything to you, but you kind of get the joy of cleaving through a whole bunch of things. So on the top of the scale, when you have these skill challenges, you want to be able to set the tone immediately, and you don't want to be afraid of what's going on here. I've noticed a lot of DMs are like, oh, I don't want to tell the players exactly what's happening here because I want to reveal it slowly, or I want to describe it and they'll know what I mean. And that can work. You do want to use evocative language. We are enjoying describing things to the players, but there is a danger there. And that is that if you want to tell the players that they're in very real danger of horrible, horrible things happening to them, you can say this could be deadly or this will be deadly. And for them, they hear, oh, that sounds like adventure. That sounds like a challenge. They don't hear we are going to die. They hear we are going to be heroes, right? Because they're not playing this game to go take on something easy. If you tell them, this could be a cakewalk, then they're not really going to be excited about that. Even if it is mechanically kind of what the game is set up to do, they're going to be able to succeed, or they're very likely to be able to succeed. Now, if you switch it around and say, this is now, rather than it being a, hey, we rolled for initiative, let's put our pieces on the board and let's go into combat, you say, this is now a skill challenge to see if any of you make it out of this encounter alive. That is a very different animal. That is a different adventure that's being run. And that's what I like to do at the top of this curve over here. This skill challenge mark here. You encounter the level 5 solo at level 1, or the level 6 or 8 solo at level 1. It's not a game about fighting monsters now. You've changed genres. You are now in a horror movie. It is about how you can get away. And being able to have a track like this where you can change how the monster dramatically interacts with the players and how much of the encounter budget, how much of the focus that this monster is, then that can give you some tools to show the players when they go up in tier, when they go up in level, when they go and fight something and still have it be a relevant threat to them. But it's now not the genre-defining thing of, say, a troll to a level 1 party. That is this thing where it is going to take you out. A war troll that is, a level 14 standard monster is just going to be a rampaging badass for a level 1 group, and they're really not going to be able to do anything to it, and you can tell that to them on the onset. And when they find trolls later on, when they go to fight another one, and it's a hard fight, but they can win this time, when they roll initiative, it's like, okay, let's get the pieces out, you can actually handle this. Now, part of that, I think, feels bad to people because they don't want to be told the style of what they're going into, but at the end of the day, guys, we're playing a game, and when you really dig down into this element, the DM is picking how this monster presents itself, how this monster is being put before the players, and just telling the players a little bit more about what their characters could feel in world is not going to be breaking anything, right? You as the DM, you can describe sights and sounds and smells and all this sort of stuff, but you're not really going to be able to perfectly replicate what it feels like to be a living, breathing creature in this world and translate that into your players. So the thing that I always tell my players is like, look, your character always has more knowledge about what the hell's going on and has a better read on what's happening than you guys have as players. I'm going to use some of these tools like telling you what's going on in order to kind of better clue you into what's happening. So we go up and we go down, we focus on the troll. Hey, the troll is defining the genre that we're in. Okay, we're higher level. The troll is just really hard and all the group can take on one of them. All right, we've found a pair of trolls and now they're still dangerous, but we can take down 2 of them and their mechanics sort of alter, right? If you have something that is designed to be the center of attention, it's a solo in 4th edition, it might have the elite template in Pathfinder 2nd edition, or in 5th edition, it might have legendary actions or lair actions that it's doing. There are these things that we have that are tools that help us point the dramatic spotlight at exactly where we wanted to point it and do exactly what we wanted to do. So we should use those tools. What I'm telling you guys as DMs is there's another piece of your toolbox that you can use where if you want to take that monster and change its level and tack on some abilities, if you're making it lower level, but you don't want it to automatically hit the players and have the players automatically miss it, you want to make it a little bit more of a fight, but you want to give it this more impressive persona, slap on some extra abilities onto it. Give it an aura, give it a multi-attack, give it a way to shake off conditions, right? Make this thing terrifying so that when it is going against something that should be out of the league for the things it's fighting it, right? The troll is going after the level 1 characters. It is able to warp the world around it. It's able to change the genre from the heroic adventuring story to being a horror story. Now, there's one other type of progression that I did want to talk about for a second, and that's we know what to do. So there's a lot of things that that have kind of puzzle elements to it in Dungeons & Dragons. Some of them are literal puzzles, but a lot of times there are puzzles of how do we as a group work together. And those things will work over time, right? The players, even if they're experienced players, they'll sort of get better at working with each other, knowing what their abilities are, knowing how their spells and powers and abilities and all interact, knowing how to put together combinations of things, knowing like, okay, I know on the next round the fighter is likely to do this, or I understand that because these creatures are marked, they're going to be less likely to do this, or even, hey, I can do this thing that's going to enable one of my other players to use one of their cool abilities. I remember doing it in a couple fights ago. Those sorts of things, we know what to do, we know how to function together. That's going to happen naturally over the course of a campaign. But this one is specifically the silver bullet problem. And I have a special sort of spot in my heart for the silver bullet, but I think it needs to have 3 stages. I think that the silver bullet problem in its essence needs to be something that if you do not have that silver bullet and you do not have a way of getting around that immunity, that resistance that a monster has, then you are going to be in a world of hurt. Now, I dislike how 5th edition does it. And the example here that you can see on the screen is from the Werejackal or the Jackalwere, and it is completely immune, and it's also CR 1/2 to a lot of things. Now, it does kind of do a good job of teaching new 5th edition players that if they really want to be relevant in the campaign, they need to be a magic user of some kind, but I don't know if that's exactly the vibe we want to give to people when they're first playing. The creatures basically are indestructible against people unless they can either use magic against it, which again at low levels is going to be relatively limited, cantrips and maybe a spell or 2 a day, or they are not super relevant if you have things that are silvered or magical weapons. So you have either you have the way around it a little bit, but you're completely useless otherwise, and then you have these guys are normal, right? But there isn't really a feel good on this guy. On this type of immunity, this type of silver bullet, it doesn't really feel like they're gaining anything. They don't feel like they're progressing. They're not really learning. Maybe it's not as big of a pain in the ass, but the absence of pain is not the presence of fun. And the absence of being stonewalled is not the presence of progression. So when you have the trick, you should be able to bypass it. So I'm going to give you a good example from the Shadow Giant from 4th edition. And again, you can pick these examples from 5th edition. I'm more familiar with 4th, so that's why a lot of my good examples come from 4th. So the Shadow Giant is insubstantial, which means he takes half damage from all attacks, and he resists 20 necrotic damage. Resistance in 4th edition is more like damage reduction, so whenever he takes necrotic damage, you just take off 20 points of damage, and that's what he takes. He takes 25 necrotic. Actually, he takes 5 necrotic. Now, that being said, if they know that this thing needs to have radiant damage done to it, whenever it's dealt radiant damage, it loses the insubstantial trait until its next turn. That means that if you as a group can work together and go, we know this guy has revealed by radiance, we're not going to lay our most powerful attacks on it until we can tag it with something radiant, and then that's going to lower the threshold, right? So it's still killable, right? It's not immune when it's insubstantial. It's just taking half damage from everything. It's resistant in 5th edition terms to everything, which means that it's got effectively double the health, and it's going to be really, really nasty. And even within that, it has a special Bailiwick where it's very, very powerful. This creature is a creature of shadow, and it resists necrotic specifically quite hard. So you have multiple elements here where the players can kind of tweak a little bit and say, all right, well, we know what we need to hit this guy with. We need to wait for somebody to tag him with Radiant. He loses that thing. Now he's taking full damage. Now we can all lay into him, but even then we have to be aware that this is a creature of shadow, and even when he gains his ability back, and even when he doesn't have his ability to take half damage, he's knocking off things that are specifically hitting him where he's strong, which is in that necrotic resist. So we have multiple toggles here rather than it's immune from everything unless you have the trick, and you can somewhat get around it with magic. Now, the somewhat get around it from magic bit might seem like I'm just sort of hand-waving that away, but the problem that I have with these is a lot of times the bad examples or the worst examples are very low level, and this guy being CR 1/2 means that you really just don't have that much options to use against it, and it is going to be very narrow what you're doing, and that's even ignoring the fact that the Jackalware has some other nasty things on its stat block, like a sleep, which has a very low chance to hit, but also removes players from the combat and could possibly remove the caster from the combat that has the ability to actually damage one of these things. So those are just two quick ways. I know that this video probably ballooned a little bit longer than I intended to. Two quick ways to talk about how we can progress, how we can get to this top of the mountain, this feel that we've gone from some dark place back into the light. And what I would recommend that people try to do is check out 4th edition monsters and how the scaling works, going from being minions to standards to elites to solos. And if you don't know, you can check some of like Matt Colville's videos and stuff. Same thing with action-oriented monsters can build into this thing of focusing the spotlight when you need to focus on the villains on an important villain, right? You give them action-oriented actions. It's very similar to giving it to elite or solo actions from 4th edition. And you're going to draw the player's attention to this, and you're going to make them feel like when they accomplish something that they're actually taking over something. And when they fight these creatures later on, it's not going to be this obnoxious thing that they just can't hit it, or the monsters can't hit them, where you're just rolling a bunch of dice to not really do much of anything. Instead, you're going to have something that still has a decent chance to hit you. You have a decent chance to hit them, but the amount of effect they have on you, the narrative impact that the creature has, changes because they are scaled to match how much drama they're supposed to bring to the combat. And that's it for today.